August 15th, 2019. Amarillo, Texas. Dutch Holloway was closing his diner when the girl crashed through his front door. Blood on her face, terror in her eyes. 3 black SUVs circling the parking lot like vultures. Dutch had 30 seconds to make a choice that would either save her life or end his own. He grabbed her hand, looked straight into the security camera he knew was being watched, and said the words that changed everything. "You're in danger. Pretend I'm your father." What happened in the next 48 hours made the FBI reopen every missing persons case in the Texas Panhandle for the past 20 years, made a sheriff disappear without a trace, made a dead girl's grave worth digging up. But most shocking of all was what Dutch found in that girl's locket. A photograph that proved his daughter Maria hadn't died in 1996. She'd been running ever since. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The midnight air hung thick with diesel fumes and danger as Dutch's weathered hand closed around the girl's trembling fingers. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen decades worth of horror. "Dad?" she whispered, catching on faster than he'd expected. Smart girl. That might keep them both alive. The lead SUV's engine rumbled to a stop just outside the diner's large front windows. Dutch could see the silhouettes of at least 3 men inside, their faces obscured by the darkness, but their intentions crystal clear. He'd lived in this part of Texas long enough to recognize predators when he saw them. "Kitchen, now." Dutch guided her through the narrow space between tables, his boots silent on the checkered linoleum he'd walked across thousands of times over the past 5 years. The diner had been his refuge after retiring from ranching, a simple place where the biggest drama was usually someone complaining about cold coffee or overcooked eggs. Those days were about to become a distant memory. The back door led to an alley that reeked of grease and rotting vegetables from the dumpster. Dutch's pickup truck sat 30 yards away, a battered Ford F-250 that had seen better decades but still ran like a thoroughbred when it mattered. He'd parked it there out of habit, never imagining he'd need a quick escape route from his own business. "Can you run?" Dutch asked, studying the girl's torn jeans and the way she favored her left leg. "I've been running for 3 days straight." Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place. Maybe Oklahoma, maybe Arkansas. These are the first people who've gotten this close. Car doors slammed behind them. Dutch counted 4 distinct sounds, which meant more men than he'd initially seen. Professional hunters didn't travel light, and whoever was after this girl had resources. They made it halfway to the truck before the first flashlight beam swept across the alley. Dutch pressed the girl against the brick wall of the adjacent building, feeling her heart hammering against his chest. She smelled like fear and desperation, mixed with something else, a floral perfume that seemed oddly familiar. "Federal agents," a voice shouted from behind them. "Nobody needs to get hurt here." Dutch almost believed it until he caught sight of the speaker's shoes. Real federal agents wore sensible footwear. This man's boots were hand-tooled leather that cost more than most people made in a month. Dutch had seen enough cartel operatives over the years to know the difference. "Those aren't feds," he whispered. The girl nodded grimly. "I know exactly who they are." Dutch's truck key felt heavy in his palm as they crept the remaining distance. He'd installed a remote starter 2 months ago, a luxury he'd justified by telling himself Texas summers were getting hotter each year. Tonight, that small indulgence might save their lives. The engine turned over on the first try, drawing immediate attention. Voices shouted in rapid Spanish, and Dutch caught enough words to know they weren't discussing the weather. These men were coordinating a capture operation, and they'd done this before. "Get down!" Dutch yanked the passenger door open and practically threw the girl inside. Gunshots echoed off the alley walls as he dove behind the wheel, the familiar cab of his truck suddenly feeling like a fortress under siege. The F-250 lurched forward, tires screaming against asphalt. Dutch had learned to drive on ranch roads where hesitation could mean getting stuck in mud for hours. Tonight, hesitation could mean getting buried in that same mud permanently. They burst onto Main Street with the SUVs already in pursuit. Dutch knew these roads better than anyone. Every pothole, every blind curve, every shortcut through the maze of farm roads that spiderwebbed across the Texas Panhandle. But his pursuers had newer vehicles and apparently unlimited ammunition. "Who are you?" Dutch asked as he took a hard right onto Highway 287, heading north toward nowhere in particular. The girl was digging through a small backpack, her movements frantic. "Someone who knows too much about the wrong people." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you right now." She pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. "But maybe this will help." Dutch glanced over as she unwrapped what appeared to be an antique locket, its silver surface tarnished with age. Even in the dim light from the dashboard, he could see intricate engravings along its edges, a pattern of roses and thorns that made his blood turn to ice water. He'd buried an identical locket 23 years ago. "Where did you get that?" The words came out rougher than he'd intended. The girl's fingers trembled as she opened the locket, revealing a small photograph tucked inside. Dutch caught a glimpse of dark hair and familiar eyes before a bullet shattered his rear window. The next 40 to 8 hours would prove that sometimes the dead don't stay buried, and sometimes the people you trust most are the ones holding the shovel. 23 years earlier, Dutch had knelt beside a mahogany casket on a rain-soaked October morning, his calloused fingers wrapped around an identical silver locket as Father Martinez spoke words about God's plan and eternal rest. The roses and thorns engraved along its edges had been worn smooth by Maria's constant touch, a nervous habit she developed after her mother's death when she was 12. Dutch had slipped that locket into the casket during the viewing, whispering promises to a daughter who would never hear them again. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated by his headlights and punctuated by the muzzle flashes in his rearview mirror. But Dutch's mind was trapped in that funeral parlor, remembering how Maria's dark hair had been arranged across the white satin pillow, how her hands had been folded across the blue dress she'd worn to her high school graduation just 3 months before. The closed casket service had been a mercy. The accident had been that bad, his brother Jake had explained. Fire and twisted metal in a daughter's dreams reduced to ash on Farm Road 1541. "Look at me," the girl beside him said, her voice cutting through the memory like a blade. Dutch forced himself to focus on the present. The SUVs had fallen back slightly, their drivers apparently more cautious about the winding curves than Dutch was. Good. He'd driven these roads for 4 decades, first hauling cattle to market, then equipment to oil rigs, finally just wandering when the loneliness in his empty ranch house became too much to bear. "I can't," he said. "Need to watch the road. You need to see this." She held the photograph from the locket closer to the dashboard light. "Tell me what you see." Dutch allowed himself a quick glance and felt his chest constrict. The photograph showed a young woman with Maria's eyes, Maria's stubborn chin, Maria's way of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was thinking. But this woman looked older, harder, marked by experiences that his sheltered ranch daughter had never faced. "Someone who looks like someone I used to know." The words felt like gravel in his throat. "What was her name?" Dutch's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The speedometer needle was hovering at 85, faster than he'd driven since the night he'd raced to the hospital, hoping against hope that the deputy who'd knocked on his door had been wrong about the accident. That night, he'd arrived too late. Tonight felt like a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. Maria Elena Holloway. Her full name felt foreign on his tongue after years of speaking only to her gravestone. Born December 23rd. Loved horses and old movies and chocolate chip pancakes on Sunday mornings. Died 3 days after her 18th birthday when her car went off the road during a rainstorm. The girl was quiet for a long moment. She loved to braid her hair with wildflowers she picked behind the barn. She could ride bareback before she could properly tie her shoes. And she used to sneak into your study to read your old Louis L'Amour novels because you told her they weren't appropriate for young ladies. Dutch's foot eased off the accelerator. Those weren't details from newspaper obituaries or public records. Those were the small, private memories that only a father would know or share. "Who told you those things?" Instead of answering, she reached into her backpack again and pulled out a faded photograph, this one larger and creased from years of handling. Even in the dim light, Dutch could make out the image, a younger version of himself standing beside a Palomino mare, his arm around a dark-haired girl in a yellow sundress. Maria at 16, the summer before everything changed. He'd kept an identical photograph on his nightstand until the day he'd moved off the ranch and into the small apartment above the diner. Looking at it every morning had been like pressing on an open wound, so he'd finally put it away in a shoebox with the rest of her things, school awards and riding ribbons and the letter she'd written to the state university about studying veterinary medicine. That was taken the day before she left for that church youth retreat, the girl said softly. She didn't want to go. Said she was too old for youth group activities. But you convinced her it would be good for her to spend time with kids her own age. The retreat where she'd met the boy who'd been driving the night she died. Another detail Dutch had tried for 23 years to forget. You're starting to scare me, Dutch said. Behind them, the SUVs had closed the gap again. Ahead, the road curved toward a series of low hills dotted with oil derricks and abandoned farmhouses. Dutch knew a dozen places to hide among those structures, but hiding would only delay the inevitable. These men wouldn't give up, and eventually his truck would run out of gas or luck or both. My name is Elena Vasquez, the girl said. But I think you knew me by a different name once. Dutch's world tilted sideways as understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. The words hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon waiting to discharge. Dutch's vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might black out behind the wheel. The truck drifted toward the shoulder before he jerked it back onto the asphalt, gravel spraying behind them like shrapnel. No, the word escaped as barely a whisper. No, that's not possible. Elena, Maria, whoever she was, reached across the cab and steadied the wheel with her free hand. Her touch was gentle but firm, exactly the way Maria used to guide him through his grief after her mother's cancer took her. The same small hands, the same careful pressure. I know this is... She's dead. Dutch's voice cracked like old leather. I buried her. I stood over her grave every Sunday for 10 years. I watched them lower that casket into the ground. You buried someone else. Elena's voice was steady now, stronger. Someone they told you was me. The truck hit a pothole hard enough to rattle their teeth. Behind them, the SUVs were gaining ground again, their headlights painting the inside of the cab in harsh white light. Dutch could hear engines roaring, could see muzzle flashes in his peripheral vision, but the immediate danger felt distant compared to the earthquake splitting open his chest. Jake confirmed the identification, Dutch said, clinging to facts like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Sheriff's Department doesn't make mistakes like that. Not about something like that. Elena pulled something else from her backpack, a small notebook with a cracked leather cover. Even in the dashboard light, Dutch recognized it immediately. He'd given it to Maria for her 16th birthday, told her every writer needed a place to collect her thoughts. She'd carried it everywhere, scribbling poetry and song lyrics and complaints about homework. Page 43, Elena said, flipping through worn pages. Read what it says. Dutch kept his eyes on the road, but she began reading aloud in a voice that carried the cadence of someone reciting a prayer. Daddy thinks I don't know about the whiskey bottle he keeps behind the paint cans in the garage. He goes out there when he thinks I'm asleep, just sits on that old lawn chair and stares at Mom's picture. Sometimes I hear him crying. I wish I knew how to fix his heart the way he fixed my broken arm when I fell off Buttercup. The steering wheel slipped in Dutch's sweaty palms. He'd never told anyone about those late-night visits to the garage, about the ritual of grief he'd developed in the months after his wife's death. Maria had been 13 then, already carrying too much sadness for someone so young. Anyone could have written that, he said, but his conviction was crumbling. Someone who knew us, who what? Who would fake being your dead daughter? Elena's laugh held no humor. What possible reason could someone have for that? A bullet punched through the rear window and embedded itself in the dashboard between them. Dutch instinctively swerved left, taking them off the highway and onto a narrow farm road that led deeper into oil country. The SUVs followed, their superior suspension handling the rough terrain better than his aging Ford. They've been looking for me for 2 weeks, Elena said, clutching the notebook to her chest. Ever since I escaped from a house in Lubbock where they were keeping 12 other girls. Girls who were supposed to disappear just like I did. Escaped from what? The life they forced me into after they faked my death." Her voice hardened. "After your brother sold me to them for $50,000 and a promise to look the other way while they ran their operation through Amarillo." The truck hit a washout and went airborne for a heart-stopping second. When they landed, Dutch's phone was ringing. The caller ID showed a number he recognized, Sheriff's Department. Jake's direct line. "Don't answer it," Elena said. But Dutch was already hitting the speaker button, his world unraveling faster than he could process. Jake's familiar voice filled the cab, calm and reassuring in the way that had gotten Dutch through 23 years of believing his daughter was at peace. "Dutch, you need to pull over right now. That girl you're with is dangerous. She's a wanted fugitive with multiple warrants. Just stop the truck and let my people handle this." Elena leaned toward the phone, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that Dutch had never heard from his teenage daughter. "Hello, Uncle Jake. Did you miss me?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched like a held breath. When Jake finally spoke again, his voice had lost its warmth. "Elena Vasquez died in federal custody 3 years ago. Whoever you think you're helping, Dutch, she's not who she claims to be." Elena smiled, and it was Maria's smile twisted by years of suffering. "Funny. That's exactly what you said about Maria Holloway." Dutch's finger found the disconnect button as understanding finally, completely destroyed everything he thought he knew about the last 23 years of his life. The silence that followed felt heavier than the humid Texas air pressing against the windshield. Dutch's finger trembled over the phone as if the device might explode in his hands. 23 years of Sunday dinners with Jake, of shared grief and whiskey-soaked conversations about Maria, of trusting the only family he had left, all of it crashing down like a house built on sand. "Pull over," Dutch said quietly. "Just pull over and let me think. We can't stop." Elena's eyes never left the side mirrors. "Those SUVs are still back there, and now Jake knows exactly where we are." But Dutch was already slowing the truck, his mind reeling between denial and a terrible growing certainty. He guided them into the shadow of an abandoned oil derrick, its skeletal frame reaching toward stars that seemed impossibly distant. The engine ticked in the sudden quiet, and somewhere in that darkness, Dutch could hear his own heartbeat. "This isn't real." He gripped the steering wheel like an anchor. "People don't just come back from the dead. Sheriffs don't sell their own family members. This is some kind of mistake, or look at me." Elena's voice carried the same patience Maria had used when teaching him to braid her horse's mane. "Really look." Dutch turned, and in the pale light from the dashboard, he saw things he'd been too terrified to acknowledge. The way she unconsciously tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was nervous, Maria's habit. The small scar above her right eyebrow from when she'd fallen off the barn roof at age 10. The precise way she held her shoulders when she was scared but trying not to show it. "I kept that locket hidden for 23 years, she said softly, "sewn into the lining of whatever clothes they gave me. It was the only thing I had left of who I used to be." Dutch's throat felt raw. "Jake said you were in federal custody. That Elena Vasquez was dead." Elena Vasquez was the name they gave me after. Her fingers traced the notebook's worn cover, the identity they created for a girl who was supposed to disappear completely. But I never forgot who I really was, even when they tried to beat it out of me. The sound of engines grew louder. Through the rear window, Dutch could see headlights sweeping the farm road, methodical as bloodhounds. His phone buzzed with an incoming text message. "Stop running. You're only making this harder on yourself. Jay." Dutch stared at the message from his brother, and something cold settled in his chest. Jake had never been one for texting, claimed the technology was too complicated for old fingers. But there was something else. The tone was wrong, too familiar, too comfortable with giving orders. "How long?" Dutch asked. "How long what? How long has Jake been—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Since before I was taken, maybe longer. The trafficking operation has been running through Amarillo for decades. Small girls from broken families, runaways, girls nobody would look for too hard. Jake made sure the investigations went nowhere." Dutch felt bile rise in his throat. "And when his own niece became inconvenient?" I'd started asking questions about some girls from school who'd gone missing. Rebecca Martinez from the church youth group. Sarah Chen, whose family thought she'd run away to California. Elena's voice grew harder. I was 18, legally an adult, too old for what their clients usually wanted, but still young enough to be useful. So Jake arranged for Maria Holloway to die in a convenient accident. The car was completely burned, Dutch said slowly, remembering the details he'd tried so hard to forget. Jake said dental records were the only way to confirm. Dental records can be switched. Bodies can be misidentified, especially when the sheriff is the one handling the investigation. Dutch's phone rang again. This time, Jake's name appeared on the screen, not just his number. Personal, insistent. Don't answer, Elena warned. But Dutch needed to hear it, needed to listen to his brother's voice and try to find some remnant of the man who'd held him when he cried at Maria's funeral. He hit the speaker button. Dutch, son, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Jake's voice carried the authority of 4 decades in law enforcement. That woman is dangerous. She's been involved with cartel operations, prostitution rings, drug trafficking. She's using your grief against you. Then why are you so scared of her? Dutch asked quietly. The pause stretched too long. When Jake spoke again, something had shifted in his tone, a hardness Dutch had never heard directed at him. Because she's already killed 3 men trying to apprehend her, and if you don't bring her in, I can't guarantee your safety either. The line went dead. In the distance, Dutch could see the SUVs had stopped searching and were now positioned at both ends of the farm road, blocking the exits. Elena touched his arm gently. Now do you believe me? Dutch looked at his daughter, alive, damaged, but undeniably real, and felt the last of his old world crumble away. Watching the red taillights of the SUVs like the eyes of predators in the darkness. The trap was closing, but the real cage had been built 23 years ago with lies and a funeral for an empty casket. His hands shook as he reached for the keys still dangling from the ignition. They know this area better than I thought, he said, his voice hollow. Jake's had decades to map every back road, every hiding spot. Elena was studying the oil derrick above them, its rusted framework creaking in the night wind. How well do you remember this place? Used to lease grazing rights here back in the 80s. Dutch followed her gaze upward. Before the oil company moved in and poisoned the water table. Is there another way out? Dutch closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct a landscape that had been carved up by drilling operations and abandoned when the wells ran dry. Maybe. There's an old cattle trail that runs behind these derricks, leads to Highway 60, but it's been 20 years since I've seen it. Better than sitting here waiting for them to decide we've suffered enough. The casual way she said it, suffered enough, made Dutch's stomach lurch. He turned to look at her again, searching for traces of the girl who used to beg him to let her stay up past bedtime to watch old westerns. That girl had known suffering only in the abstract, from books and movies. This woman spoke of it like an old friend. What did they do to you? The question escaped before he could stop it. Elena's expression shuttered closed. You don't want to know. Yes, I do. Dutch's voice gained strength. I've spent 23 years thinking you were at peace. If you were suffering while I was visiting your empty grave every Sunday, mourning the wrong loss, I need to know. A spotlight suddenly blazed from one of the SUVs, sweeping across the derrick and momentarily illuminating Elena's face. In that harsh light, Dutch saw lines around her eyes that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with surviving things that would have broken most people. The first house was in El Paso, she said quietly. Jake told them I was a runaway, that nobody would look for me. They kept me locked in a basement room with 2 other girls for 6 months before they moved us to Lubbock. Dutch gripped the steering wheel harder. Jesus Christ. The clients liked the young ones best, but I was still useful for other things. Cleaning money, carrying drugs across county lines, keeping the newer girls in line. Elena's voice remained steady, clinical. They told me that if I ever tried to escape, they'd take Maria's place at the cemetery and make it real this time. But you did escape. 3 times. The first 2, Jake's people brought me back. Said I was a federal witness who'd violated protection protocols. Elena pulled the notebook closer to her chest. Turns out it's easy to disappear someone when you've got badges and official paperwork. The spotlight moved on, leaving them in darkness that felt like a reprieve. Dutch started the engine and began backing slowly away from the derrick, using its bulk to shield them from the SUVs. His mind was working through calculations, distance to the old cattle trail, how much ground they could cover before the spotlights found them again. But underneath the tactical planning, a deeper horror was taking root. Every Sunday for a decade, he'd brought fresh flowers to Maria's grave. Wildflowers mostly, the same ones she used to braid into her hair. He'd knelt on the grass and told her about his day, about the diner business, about how much he missed her mother's laugh echoing through their empty house. All while she was alive, while she was trapped and brutalized and probably wondering why her father had stopped looking for her. "Why didn't you try to contact me?" The words tasted bitter. Some sign, some message. "I did." Elena's voice broke slightly. "The second year, I convinced one of the guards to mail a letter. Just a few lines telling you I was alive and where to find me." Dutch felt something cold settle in his chest. "I never got any letter." "Jake did. He showed it to me the next time they brought me back. Said you'd thrown it away without opening it, that you'd moved on and didn't want to be reminded of your dead daughter." The truck rolled to a stop behind another derrick. Dutch couldn't see the SUVs anymore, but he could hear engines idling, radios crackling with coordinated search patterns. Professional, patient, the kind of operation that came from years of practice hunting runaway girls through the Texas panhandle. "I would never have thrown away a letter from you," Dutch whispered. "I know that now. But I was 19 and broken, and I'd already watched 2 other girls get killed for trying to reach their families." Elena touched his shoulder, and her hand felt exactly like Maria's had when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "So I stopped trying to be your daughter and learned how to be someone who could survive long enough to make them pay." Dutch looked at her, really looked, and saw something that terrified him more than the armed men hunting them through the darkness. He saw his daughter's eyes filled with his own capacity for violence, honed by 23 years of necessity and rage. "What did you do to escape the third time?" Elena smiled, and it was nothing like Maria's smile anymore. "I killed everyone who tried to stop me." Dutch stared at his daughter, his living, breathing daughter who spoke of killing with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd once used to discuss homework. The truck idled behind the derrick, while his mind struggled to process 23 years of carefully constructed lies unraveling in a single night. How many? The question left his lips before he could stop it. "Does it matter?" Elena shifted in her seat, and Dutch caught a glimpse of something metallic tucked beneath her jacket. "They weren't people anymore, Daddy. They were predators who'd forgotten what happens when prey learns to bite back." Daddy. She'd called him Daddy, the way she had when she was 8 and needed him to check for monsters under her bed. Now she was the monster, forged by the very evil he'd failed to protect her from. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Jake. "Last chance to do this easy." Dutch stared at the message and felt something shift inside his chest, not breaking, but hardening, like metal cooling after being heated in a forge. "Jake taught you to shoot when you were 14. Said every Texas girl should know how to handle a gun." Elena's voice carried a bitter edge. "Ironic, considering. You always were a quick learner." Dutch put the truck in gear and began navigating between the maze of abandoned derricks, following half-remembered paths from decades ago. "Your mother used to worry you were too smart for your own good. Turns out she was right." They crested a small hill, and Dutch could see the cattle trail stretching out before them, overgrown and pocked with washouts, but passable. Behind them, spotlights began sweeping the derrick field in systematic patterns. Professional hunters who'd done this before. "Elena," Dutch said carefully, testing the name that wasn't really hers. "When did you decide to come back?" 2 weeks ago, when I finally got access to Jake's files." She pulled a manila folder from her backpack, thick with documents and photographs. "Turns out your brother's been very thorough about documenting his business activities." Dutch glanced at the folder and felt his stomach lurch. Even in the dashboard light, he could see the edge of what looked like surveillance photos. Young faces, missing persons reports, a systematic catalog of destroyed lives. "How many girls?" he asked. "In 23 years. At least 60 that I can prove." Probably twice that many. Elena's voice remained steady, but Dutch could see her hands trembling. Jake built an entire network. Local law enforcement in 3 counties, judges, federal contacts. All of them looking the other way while children disappeared. The cattle trail dipped into a wash that Dutch remembered from his ranching days. The truck bounced and scraped against rocks, but the old Ford held together. Behind them, the SUVs had found their trail and were closing fast, their engines roaring as they navigated the rough terrain. "Why now?" Dutch asked. "Why come back after all this time?" Elena opened the folder and pulled out a photograph that made Dutch's blood freeze. It showed Jake in his sheriff's uniform, smiling as he shook hands with a man Dutch didn't recognize. Between them stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 15, her eyes vacant and hopeless. "Because he's planning to retire next year," Elena said, "and he wants to tie up loose ends before he goes. That includes eliminating anyone who might cause problems for his replacement." Dutch understood immediately. "You're not the only one coming forward. 3 other survivors have surfaced in the past 6 months. 2 of them are already dead, officially ruled suicides." Elena tucked the photograph back into the folder. "The 3rd one is in protective custody with the FBI, but Jake doesn't know that yet." The truck burst out of the wash and onto a paved road that Dutch recognized, Highway 60, just like he'd hoped. But as he turned toward Amarillo, his headlights illuminated 2 more SUVs blocking the intersection ahead. The trap hadn't just been behind them, it had been waiting for them to run exactly where they'd run. "He knows how you think," Elena observed quietly. "Knows this land as well as you do." Dutch brought the truck to a stop 50 yards from the roadblock. In his rearview mirror, he could see the other SUVs emerging from the cattle trail, 6 vehicles total, maybe 20 armed men, the kind of overwhelming force that left no room for negotiation. His phone rang one final time. Jake's voice filled the cab when Dutch answered, and there was no pretense of family warmth left in it. "Game over, Dutch. Step out of the truck with your hands visible." "What happens to her?" Dutch asked. Elena Vasquez was a federal witness who violated her protection agreement and killed 3 marshals. "She'll be shot while resisting arrest." Jake's tone was purely business now, clinical in its efficiency. "You were an unfortunate casualty who got caught in the crossfire while trying to help what you thought was an innocent girl." Dutch looked at his daughter, scarred, dangerous, but undeniably alive. "And if I don't step out, then you'll die believing your daughter actually loved you enough to come home." The line went dead, but Jake's words echoed in the truck cab like a curse. Dutch realized his brother had just revealed the one thing he'd never understood. That love wasn't weakness to be exploited, but strength that could move mountains or burn down worlds. Elena's hand found his across the seat. "I did come home, Daddy." "I know you did, sweetheart." Dutch smiled and shifted the truck into drive. "Hold on tight." Dutch floored the accelerator, and the old Ford lurched forward toward the roadblock. Elena braced herself against the dashboard as spotlights blazed to life, turning the night into a harsh theater of shadows and glare. "There's a drainage culvert about half a mile up," Dutch shouted over the roar of the engine. "Big enough for the truck if we can make it." "They'll follow us," Elena called back, checking the pistol she'd pulled from beneath her jacket, a compact Glock that looked well used. "Not all of them." Dutch's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Jake's got to maintain the story. Can't have too many witnesses to an accidental shooting." The SUV blocking their path started moving, trying to angle across the full width of the highway. Dutch yanked the wheel hard right, sending the truck careening onto the shoulder. Gravel sprayed against the undercarriage as they scraped past the roadblock with inches to spare. Gunfire erupted behind them, controlled bursts that spoke of professional training. The rear window spider-webbed but held. Dutch kept the accelerator pinned as the truck fishtailed back onto the asphalt. "Jake taught you well," Elena said grimly, ejecting her magazine to check the rounds. "Your grandfather taught us both. Said a man who couldn't outrun trouble better be prepared to outfight it." Dutch glanced at the mirror and saw 4 sets of headlights pursuing them. "How many rounds you got?" "Enough." Elena's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd learned to make every bullet count. "Daddy, there's something else you need to know. Now's not exactly the time for family stories, sweetheart." "This is." She pulled out a second photograph from the folder, this one showing a younger Jake standing beside a man in an expensive suit. The trafficking operation wasn't Jake's idea. He was recruited by someone higher up the food chain. Dutch recognized the second man immediately, and his heart sank. Senator Morrison, your old army buddy, the one who helped Jake get elected sheriff in the first place. Elena's words hit Dutch like physical blows. This whole thing has been protected from the federal level for decades. The FBI agents Jake claims are coming to arrest me? They're on Morrison's payroll. The drainage culvert appeared in the headlights, a concrete tunnel that disappeared into darkness beneath the highway overpass. Dutch downshifted and sent the truck plunging into the ditch, praying the 40-year-old suspension would hold together. That's why you couldn't go to the authorities, Dutch realized as they bounced through the culvert. There was nobody left to trust. The corruption goes all the way up. Local police, county sheriffs, state investigators, federal agents. Morrison's had 23 years to place his people everywhere. Elena gripped the door handle as the truck emerged from the tunnel and began climbing the opposite bank. The only reason I'm still alive is because I've got evidence that could bring down half the law enforcement structure in Texas. Behind them, only 2 SUVs had attempted to follow through the culvert. The others were probably racing around to cut them off at the next intersection. Dutch pushed the truck harder, feeling the engine strain against years of honest ranch work. The notebook, he said suddenly. That's not your diary. Names, dates, bank account numbers, photographs. Elena patted the leather cover protectively. Everything Morrison and Jake thought they'd destroyed when they faked my death. I've been building this case for 23 years. They crested a hill and Dutch could see the lights of Amarillo in the distance. Home, except it wasn't home anymore. It was enemy territory controlled by the man he'd called brother for 68 years. There's a place we can go, Dutch said. Old line shack about 10 miles north of here. Been abandoned since the drought of '98. They'll find us eventually. Jake knows every hiding spot in 3 counties. Maybe, but it'll buy us time to figure out our next move. Dutch glanced at his daughter, alive, armed, and absolutely lethal. Unless you've already got a plan. Elena smiled, and for just a moment, Dutch saw traces of the mischievous girl who used to plot elaborate pranks on her Uncle Jake during family barbecues. Oh, I've got a plan, but you're not going to like it. Try me. We're going to give Jake exactly what he wants. We're going home. Elena chambered around in the Glock with practiced efficiency. It's time Uncle Jake learned what happens when family comes calling with 23 years of grievances to settle. Dutch felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd carried through 2 tours in Vietnam, when survival meant becoming someone harder than the enemy trying to kill you. He'd buried that version of himself when he came home to ranch cattle and raise a daughter in peace. But peace, it turned out, had been a lie. And some burials weren't meant to be permanent. The old Ford's engine coughed twice before dying completely as Dutch pulled into the gravel lot behind his diner. Steam rose from under the hood like incense at a funeral, which, Dutch realized, this might well be. Elena checked her weapon one final time. They'll be here in 10 minutes, maybe less. Good. Dutch stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on familiar ground. 23 years he'd opened this place every morning at 5:30, served coffee to ranchers and truckers, closed at 9, went home alone to a house that still echoed with Maria's laughter. I'm tired of running from the truth. The back door to the diner stood slightly ajar, exactly as Dutch had left it when the bloodied stranger first stumbled into his life 6 hours ago. It felt like 6 years. Everything he'd believed about his family, his brother, his carefully ordered world had been stripped away and rebuilt in the span of a single night. Elena followed him inside, moving with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to hostile territory. The diner felt different now, smaller, more fragile. The red vinyl booths where Jake used to sit every Tuesday morning for breakfast looked like props in a play Dutch was only beginning to understand. He'll come alone, Elena said, positioning herself where she could see both the front and back entrances. Jake's always preferred to handle family business personally. Will you? The question hung between them like smoke. Handle it personally. Elena's grip on the Glock never wavered. but something flickered across her face. Not uncertainty, but a grief so deep it had fossilized into purpose. He stopped being family the night he sold me to monsters. Dutch moved behind the counter, his hands finding the familiar routine of starting coffee even though nobody would be drinking it. The normalcy felt surreal, like whistling past a graveyard. Your mother used to say revenge was just grief wearing work clothes. Mama never spent 23 years learning what men will pay to do to children. Elena's voice carried no heat, only a terrible patient coldness. Some things can't be forgiven, only balanced. Headlights swept across the front windows as Jake's patrol car pulled into the lot, alone, as Elena had predicted. Dutch felt his brother's presence like a physical weight. 6 decades of shared history, shared blood, shared lies. The front door chimed as Jake entered, moving with the careful casualness of a man who knew exactly how dangerous this moment was. He wore his sheriff's uniform, his service weapon holstered but easily accessible. Even now, he was maintaining the performance. Dutch. Jake nodded to his brother, then let his gaze settle on Elena Maria. That's not my name. Elena's weapon remained steady, pointed center mass. Maria died in a car crash 23 years ago. You made sure of that. Jake's expression didn't change, but Dutch caught the slight tension around his eyes. You always were too smart for your own good. Even as a kid, asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Like why certain girls from the group home kept disappearing. Elena stepped sideways, keeping space between herself and both men. Or why you always volunteered to drive them to their new placements. Those girls had nowhere else to go. No family, no future. I gave them purpose. The words hit Dutch like a physical blow. This wasn't denial or justification. It was a man who genuinely believed he'd been providing a service. Jesus Christ, Jake, you sold children. I provided opportunities, Jake corrected calmly. The smart ones, like Maria here, learned quickly. The stubborn ones, he shrugged. Natural selection. Dutch saw Elena's finger tighten on the trigger and realized his daughter was about to commit murder in the place where he'd served coffee and pie to their neighbors for 2 decades. The symmetry felt appropriate and horrifying in equal measure. Wait. Dutch stepped between them, his hands raised. Elena, you said you had evidence. Names, accounts, the whole network. In the truck. Along with contact information for a federal prosecutor in Dallas who isn't on Morrison's payroll. Elena kept the gun trained on Jake but glanced at her father. Insurance, in case they killed me before I could testify. Jake's composure finally cracked. You stupid girl. You think Morrison will let some traumatized whore destroy everything he's built? He's got judges, FBI directors, senators. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the confined space. Jake stumbled backward, his hand flying to his shoulder where blood was already spreading across his uniform shirt. Elena's aim had been precise, incapacitating, not lethal. You want to know what I learned in 23 years of surviving your friends? Elena's voice remained perfectly steady. Patience. The difference between justice and revenge, and how to make a man wish he'd never been born. Jake reached for his service weapon with his good hand. Dutch moved without thinking, his own hands, hardened by decades of ranch work, closing around his brother's wrist with enough force to snap bone. You sold my daughter, Dutch said quietly, and Jake heard something in his brother's voice that made him stop struggling. You sat in my kitchen every Sunday, ate my food, listened to me grieve, and you knew she was alive and suffering. Jake's face had gone gray with shock and pain. Dutch, you don't understand the scope of this thing. The money, the power. We could have shared it all. We're sharing something better. Dutch released his brother's broken wrist and stepped back. We're sharing the truth. The sirens came at dawn, just as Dutch was pouring his 3rd cup of coffee. Real FBI this time, agents from the Dallas office who'd driven through the night after Elena made her call. Jake sat slumped in booth number 4, his shoulder bandaged with dish towels, his good hand cuffed to the table leg. He hadn't spoken in 2 hours. Dutch watched through the window as the federal convoy pulled into his parking lot. 6 black SUVs, unmarked sedans, even a crime scene van. The kind of response that meant someone very important was about to have a very bad day. Senator Morrison's been arrested, Elena said, closing her phone. She'd spent the pre-dawn hours walking FBI agents through 23 years of carefully documented evidence, along with 12 other officials in 4 states. They're calling it the largest human trafficking investigation in Texas history. Jake finally looked up, his face hollow with defeat. You have no idea what you've done. The organization runs deeper than what you found. There are people who will spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. Dutch interrupted. He refilled his brother's untouched coffee cup, the gesture automatic after decades of habit. It's over, Jake. The federal agents entered like a controlled storm, professional, efficient, deadly serious. Dutch recognized the lead investigator from Elena's descriptions, Agent Sarah Chen, a woman who'd been building cases against Morrison's network for 3 years without knowing how deep the corruption ran. Mr. Holloway. Chen shook Dutch's hand with genuine respect. Your daughter's testimony is going to put away some very dangerous people. Dutch glanced at Elena, who was giving her formal statement to another agent. She looked exhausted but oddly peaceful, as if a weight she'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. She's stronger than I ever imagined. She's also agreed to enter witness protection until the trials are complete. These people have long memories and international connections. How long? Could be years. Chen's expression softened slightly. I know you just got her back. Dutch nodded, watching as they led Jake toward the door in federal custody. His brother stopped at the threshold, turning back with something that might have been regret. I'm sorry, Dutch. About Maria. About everything. Dutch studied the man he'd called brother for 68 years, the boy who'd shared his bedroom, his secrets, his parents' love, the man who'd sat at his table every Sunday while his daughter suffered in hell. No, you're not, Dutch said quietly. But maybe someday you will be. Jake was gone then, disappeared into the federal machinery of justice. Dutch turned back to find Elena standing beside him, her statement complete. The agents want to move me to a safe house in Dallas tonight, she said. There's a chance Morrison's people might try something before the trials. I understand. Dutch poured her a cup of coffee, adding cream the way he remembered Maria liking it 23 years ago. Some things, it seemed, never changed. Will you write? Elena smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Every week. And when this is all over, when the last of them is behind bars, I'm coming home. Really home this time. I'll keep the diner running. Someone needs to be here when you get back. Actually, I was thinking we might try ranching again. I remember you always said the land was the only honest thing in Texas. Dutch felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but healing. Your mother used to say the same thing. They stood together in the morning light, father and daughter reunited across an impossible gulf of time and trauma. Outside, the federal agents finished their work and began departing, taking their evidence and their prisoner toward whatever justice looked like for crimes this vast. Elena gathered her things, the leather notebook, the manila folder full of horrors, the small backpack that contained everything she had. Yeah, sweetheart? Thank you for not asking what they did to me, for not trying to fix what can't be fixed. Dutch pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her the way he'd wanted to for 23 years. You fixed yourself. I'm just proud to be your father. She left with Agent Chen an hour later, disappearing into federal protection as completely as she'd vanished from his life decades ago. But this time, Dutch wasn't grieving. This time, he was waiting. He cleaned the diner methodically, erasing the traces of violence and revelation. Tomorrow, neighbors would come for breakfast and coffee, wanting to discuss the FBI raid, the arrests, the scandal that would dominate headlines for months. Dutch would serve them pie and tell them what he could. But tonight, he sat in booth number 4 with a cup of coffee, and the absolute certainty that his daughter was alive, was safe, and was coming home. Some stories, Dutch reflected, took 23 years to tell properly, but they were worth the wait.